School of Computing and Communications, and Department of Linguistics and English Language, Lancaster University. I'm happy to host today's UCREL Corpus Research Seminar, UCREL CRS. It is a forum for all staff visiting academics, postgraduates, research students, and scholars interested in corpus-based research in any area of linguistics and computer science. Allow me to welcome you today, whether you are new or returning audience. And on today's talk, we are joined by Luke Collins and Elena Semino from Corpus Approach to Social Science Research Center, or CAS, Lancaster University. Luke is a senior research associate in CAS, and Elena is the director of CAS and also a professor in linguistics. The title of their presentation today is Triangulating Corpus Linguistics and Clinical Psychology in the Study of Narrative of Voice Here. Before I hand over to Luke and Elena, just to let you know that this session is recorded, and the recording will be accessible from UCREL CRS YouTube account, and the link will be posted on our Twitter account. To avoid any disruptions during the talk, please turn off your microphone during the question and answer session and raise your hand to let me know you want to ask a question, and unmute yourself when it is your turn. You can also write your question in the chat box. All right, Luke and Elena, you can start sharing your screen and proceed with your presentation.
Great, thank you, Pri. I'll just go back to the presentation. Hello, everyone. Thank you for everyone who has turned up today, regardless, as Pri said, of where you are. We are going to share some work that we have been doing as part of one of the core projects of the current research program of CAS, which is to use corpus methods to look at first-person accounts of voice hearing, particularly in the context of psychosis, which is, we'll give you a bit more detail, but it's what we'll be looking at today. We've been working in collaboration with psychologists and others from the University of Durham. And what we're showing you today is a case where we are using corpus methods to triangulate an analysis that was done qualitatively by our colleagues at Durham. So this particular talk and this study are part of a growing tradition that many of you will be familiar with of corpus methods being used to triangulate the analyses that were done in other areas of linguistics or outside linguistics, and in our case, it's outside linguistics. Luke and I presenting today. I'll hand over to Luke in a few moments. But the people most directly involved with us in this study are Václav Brezina, whom many of you know, who's also in linguistics at Lancaster and in CAS, and Sofia Demian, who's at University College London. But as I'll mention, the collaboration is also with psychologists at the University of Durham. So what we're going to do is, I know that some of you, because we presented this, not this particular study, but we presented from this kind of data before, you may have heard us introduce the phenomenon of voice hearing that we're looking at, but I'll briefly introduce it, why it's important. And then I'll also mention specifically one particular development in psychology, which is to consider the implications of hallucinatory voices being perceived as experienced as people, as persons. And following on from that, the attempt to classify the ways in which people who hear voices perceive them as people in several ways, including in terms of a binary distinction between minimal and complex personification. Then we'll show you how the psychology colleagues at Durham have coded a set of 40 interviews with voice hearers in terms of whether they belong to minimal or complex personification, and how we have then come in to use corpus methods to do three things: test via linguistic analysis their their operationalization of this binary distinction between minimal and complex personification, provide further insights from a linguistic point of view into this distinction, and then turn this binary distinction into a scale. So that's what we'll be showing you. Before I go any further, of course, because I've started talking, there's some noise outside my window. Can somebody tell me how difficult it is to hear me, because I can hear the noise in the background. I don't know if you guys can hear me well enough.
Well, I think.
All right. Okay, so I'll carry on like this. It usually doesn't go on for that long. Right, so let me start with the phenomenon of voice hearing. By voice hearing, we mean hearing voices, the experience of hearing voices that other people can't hear. The technical term in some areas of psychology and psychiatry is auditory verbal hallucinations. So it's when you perceive a voice speaking to you in the absence of a sound that other people who might share the same environment would also be able to perceive. Now, the phenomenon of voice hearing is associated as a diagnostic criterion with a number of mental health disorders connected with the broad umbrella term of psychosis. And in particular, about 70% of people who have a diagnosis of schizophrenia report hearing voices that others cannot hear. However, not everyone who hears voices that others cannot hear has a mental health problem, never mind a diagnosis. So there are people that we're not talking about them today, that we are studying as part of the same program of research, who work as spiritualists and mediums. They hear voices that are interpreted as the voices of dead people, and then they report the messages from dead people to others, living people. And in whatever you think of the status of these experiences, spiritualists do not have, do not suffer from, not badly affected by these experiences, and don't have mental health diagnoses. And then there are in-between cases. It's not uncommon if someone close to you dies for you to still hear their voices every now and again, but that could be comforting, meaningful. It doesn't mean that you would access clinical services in order to deal with that. Now, as you can imagine, in clinical psychology and in psychiatry, there is a lot of work on voices. It's because for some people, they are a source of distress, or they interfere with people's ability to live as they want to live. And one of the areas of discussion is the idea of voices as people. So in general terms, the traditional view is that voices are sounds that people hear, auditory experiences. And because they're auditory experiences that involve saying things, they're then also interpreted as some kind of person-like agent. But a more recent view is that actually the core of the experience is to perceive the presence and the involvement of a person-like agent. And as a consequence of that, one of the things that that person-like agent can do is speak. So this idea of voices as persons is now very central, partly because it has implications for diagnosis and also for therapy and support. In what ways and to what extent people experience their voices as people. And we have done, Luke and I and Sophia Damian have already done some work from a qualitative perspective, looking at what the approaches that we have developed in linguistics and particularly in stylistics to the study of characterization in fiction, what that can contribute, especially in terms of the ability to analyze the language that people use to describe characters and voices, what that can contribute to a finer, more nuanced understanding of the ways in which voices are perceived and talked about as people. But today we're giving you a corpus linguistic perspective on that. So our data is 40 interviews with voice hearers, which were conducted by colleagues at Durham University who are part of a study called Hearing the Voice that is funded by the Wellcome Trust. They conducted these interviews in the north of England, and all the interviewees were part of an early intervention in psychosis. So they were accessing healthcare services because of their voice hearing. The total number of tokens in the interviews is just over 200,000 words. And the interviews cover the semi-structure, they cover a range of topics, how each person would describe their experiences, the nature, the quality of those experiences, what the voices say, to what extent they have a kind of personality, distinguishable personality, when the experience started, how it changed over time, and how they interpret the experience. And as I've said, one of the what the colleagues did was to code in each interview. There were two coders using a wide range of codes, and one of them was to do with the personification of voices, and it was a binary code. So they had to decide for each interview whether they were dealing with a case of minimal personification of voices or complex personification of voices. And as I said, this has implications for understanding the experience, but also providing therapeutic support. So they had this binary distinction. How did they define it? This is their definition of minimal personification. It's in a paper that was published recently in Schizophrenia Bulletin, I think. So here goes, minimal personification from a psychological perspective. The voice has few person-like qualities, is attributed to a person or described as being like a person, but without further elaboration. Person-like characteristics tend to remain stable over time and follow a single theme. The voice is mean or a nasty man. 24 out of the 40 interviews were coded as minimal. And this is an example of how one of the people whose interview was coded as minimal describes his main voice, just like an angry old man, a bit old. So you can see the person, there is a description of the voice as a person, but minimal characteristics. In contrast, complex personification applies when the voice is described as having more than one kind of person-like quality, may include elaborate descriptions of intentional states, including verbs like want and think, agency, the voice can make something happen, or identity, it comes from somewhere, and it has its own idiosyncratic characteristics. And this is not just about how much the person talks about the voice, but the fact that the voice has these multiple qualities, and qualities that involve being able to change the world or change the voice hearer in some way. The remaining 16 interviews out of 40 were coded as complex. And this is a quote from one of the interviewees whose voices were coded as complex. She'll be sitting there, this is the voice, or rather the person whose voice is heard. She'll be sitting there going, now, I'm here for you, and all that kind of thing. It's like she's done nasty stuff in the past. Why would I trust her type of thing? It could just be like, like she's trying to manipulate us a little bit. So you can see that the voice has a clear attitude. The voice is presented in direct speech. The voice does different things over time, nasty stuff, and is attributed mental states, is attributed the intention to manipulate the voice hearer. So we ended up with the 40 interviews divided into two, for us, separate corpora, the minimal personification corpus and the complex personification corpus. So we applied corpus methods to, first of all, find a way to test the validity of this distinction from a linguistic perspective. Secondly, to see whether we could find additional linguistic characteristics that were associated with the minimal versus the complex group. And thirdly, obviously, even our psychology colleagues are fully aware that this idea of voices as persons is not actually a binary. There is something to be gained for some purposes in dealing to treat it with as a binary, but in fact, it's a matter of degree. And so the third thing we are doing is use our methods to turn this binary into a scale. And Luke is now taking over and showing you what we did and our main results, and then I'll come back with the final bit and the conclusions. So Luke, you can take over now.
Thank you, Ella. Just give me an indication that, yeah, my little trigger's working. So our two aims really are here to contribute to the conceptualization of this idea of complexity that Eleanor has described as of relevance to investigations of psychosis more broadly. But we also found that there were some important methodological challenges for us as corpus linguists in doing this work that we feel have wider application as well. So the first of those was in relation to focusing our study on references to voices. So you can see from this short extract here that there's lots of different ways in which a participant might refer to a voice. They were particular voices and they were the main ones that I would hear. I would hear other stuff, but the main ones were the 7. So we couldn't restrict our search for just mentions of voices. So what we had to do was apply a simple annotation scheme to the parts of the text that we identified were in reference to a voice. And the annotation that we used here sat alongside the part of speech annotation that you get with automatic taggers in box. So you can see here that the tokens that we felt were in reference to...
I can't see the slides changing. Can everyone else see the slides changing?
The slide hasn't moved.
Yes, we need to request control, Luke.
Spare me 1 second. So it says
Yeah, now it's showing the slide now.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, so the annotation that we applied just allowed us to target those references to the voices, target the specific tokens that we manually identified were in reference to the voice. And what that allowed us to do was then to conduct the conventional corpus queries. Here you can see, hopefully, a concordance demonstrating the different nodes that are in reference to the voice. So they have all been tagged with this annotation. And then subsequently, we can generate, for example, frequency lists and collocations. So that was the first step that we had to apply in order to target our queries to specific references to the voices. And in our investigation of complexity of personhood, we looked at various ways in which that might manifest, so the different descriptions that participants might use. And we identified 4 language components that proved to be interesting, allowing us to talk about this idea of person. The first of which was the references to the voices themselves. So those tokens that we added this annotation to, giving us in what words we used in reference to the voices. Alongside that, we were looking at adjective collocates, so descriptions of the voice in terms of what qualities or characteristics they have. And this you can see ties quite nicely to the component of the manual coding where the voices are described as having more than one kind of person-like quality, being a criterion of that coding. And we were looking at what the voices were describing the capacity to do. So the particular verb collocates gave us an indication of what the voices were reported as saying and doing and having agency and these intentional states, which again was a core part of that definition of complexity. And finally, we were reminded at every stage really that the length of these participant contributions had some significance for the ways in which participants were coded as complex or otherwise. But this again introduced another kind of methodological challenge in the sense that we had quite a range of lengths of interviews in terms of those participant contributions. The shortest one was just over 1,100 tokens, and the longest one was nearly 15,000 tokens. So while there are kind of conventionalized routes for dealing with length in corpus linguistics, we did have to think a little bit about how to capture that sense that if a participant had more things to say, that might be an indicator of complexity, whilst also taking into account the fact that the length of the interview would have implications for our other areas of interest, and trying not to overstate the contribution that length would have. So inevitably, the longer that a text is, the higher number of tokens that there are, the higher number of tokens there are in reference to the voices. But it's also true that the variety of tokens tends to tail off the longer a text goes on. So our issue was that we wanted to account for length because we felt that it said something interesting about complexity, but we didn't want it to then influence our assessment of other language features as well. So we had to apply a kind of normalization to minimize the influence of just length as an impetus for complexity. So we went through this process, which was facilitated by LengthBox tools. There's a script that you can apply when you upload text that will split the text into 500 word chunks. And then we counted the other 3 of our components in each of those chunks, calculating an average over the course of that text. So for each interview, there was an average number of our language features as found in these 500-word chunks. And then if the values that you're going to see have been normalized to a rate of 100 words, just allowing for the fact that for each text there would be this part at the end that wasn't quite 500 words. So we have these normalized and relativized figures that allow us to talk about the number of different types in the data in reference to voices. So we've outlined our kind of aims for this part of the work, and these can be articulated with respect to key questions, which then have corresponding analytical steps. So the first of our questions was, does the frequency of our language components, those references to voices, those verb and adjective collocates, support the conceptualization of a minimal group and a complex group? So to do that, we're taking the values for each of those language components and performing these statistical tests to establish whether the idea of minimal or complex has validity. And then we want to see what the individual distribution of cases within those groups looks like for minimal and complex cases. So if we can establish that there is a distinction between minimal and complex, what does the within and across distribution look like? Secondly, thinking more qualitatively about the types that are used by minimal and complex participants, does that tell us anything about their correspondence as more or less complex? So for that, we're going to look at the individual types that were used and how these corresponded with particular themes, some of which lend themselves more explicitly to ideas of personhood than others. And then we're thinking about how those are distributed across the complexity groups to see if they are more characteristic of one group or another. And then finally, how does our linguistic approach augment the minimal complex binary that our colleagues have already established? And this is where we begin to think about establishing more of a scalar representation. So Ellen is going to briefly talk about some individual cases to demonstrate that. So the first step, as I say, was to use quantitative methods of statistical tests to establish the validity of this distinction between minimal and complex. So across those four language components, our references to voices, our adjective collocates and our verb collocates, and the length, you can see that the average for complex participants is higher than that for the minimal. So this indicates that if you are in the complex group, you're more likely to use a greater number of different types in each of these conditions. So that's being some indication of variety. You're more likely to use a more various range of types in relation to the voices. Now, when we have those individual values, we can see that the difference between the complex and the minimal group is statistically significant. It has a large effect size. And if we're thinking about confidence intervals, they're non-overlapping. So there is a statistical basis to say that conceptualizing these two different groups has validity with respect to these particular language features. So this just gave us the impetus to go ahead with the idea that these language features have some kind of relevance and support the idea that our colleagues defining these participants in terms of minimal and complex also has some grounding. So I'm just getting a little lag on my presentation.
Luke?
Yeah, sorry, my screen's frozen.
Okay.
Can you hear me, Bree? Yeah,
I can hear you seeing right screen.
Yeah, sorry. It seems to be. I didn't have sound a moment ago, so that seems to be a step in the right direction. I'm just waiting. I can see that my screen has stopped working. There we go.
Yeah, it's still black now.
Sorry, just bear with me 1 second. I can see that mine's actually started to. Yeah. So the first question, hopefully you can see here. If you can't, I can articulate what's on the screen. I can see my computer's catching up with me. There we go. So I'm just highlighting our first question here. Having established the quantitative basis for these features, we were interested in looking at the different types. Sorry, Pri, go on.
Yeah, it's still black. Cannot see your slides.
Can you see?
I can see your camera. Your camera is
my video working.
Your voice is also all right. Well, I can't see your slide. Have you shared your screen?
Yeah, it's telling me that the option that I have is to stop presenting, which is indicating to me that I am presenting.
Yeah, I can see your slide.
Yeah.
I can see the slide with the question.
So,
What
yeah.
suggest?
So yeah, there was just a bit of a lag. I'm hoping that for everyone else soon redress itself.
Chat, like people can see the slides.
Yes. So the next question is a more qualitative one about these particular types. Are there particular words that minimal and complex participants favor in relation to the voices? Starting with the actual terms used to refer to voices. So there was something like 460 different terms that we had. So one of the issues was to find a practical way to talk about the many various ways in which the voices were referenced. So we started to group some of these categories, and again, with our question being about personhood, we were particularly interested in those that indicated something that could be described as person-like. So you get these, sorry, I just have one eye on the chat. I think messages are still coming in about difficulties viewing.
Yeah, look, some people can see the slides and some can't. So I think one option is to stop presenting and re-upload, maybe. I don't know.
So let's have a look. I mean, 14:26 in the last minute. Yeah, so people are still having issues. I think it's going to be difficult to follow if you can't see. So I'm willing to just pause momentarily. So the last update I had was Gloriana telling us that she can see the slides at least.
Yeah, some people cannot see your slides. Some people can. It's quite strange, actually. The first time I encountered this.
If there's anyone who cannot see the slides but can see my whether they can see my camera or not, I think would be an indication of.
All right. So someone posted I solved the problem with not seeing
the slides. You can start. Yeah. So either Luke stops sharing and then starts again, or people can try leaving the meeting and back in again.
Mm.
All right. So I'll stop presenting.
Leave for a while, Luke, and come back right after and see whether that helps.
So hang on. I was just looking at the option of stopping presenting temporarily. I think, Eleanor, you might have to start again, and I can obviously still change it. So this will end the presentation for everyone to switch presenters.
I'll take control, and we can start. Okay, so actually, Fraser says that he just rejoined and it works. So okay, but
right.
Here, Luke, now you've stopped sharing, right?
Okay, now try sharing again, Luke.
Yeah, why don't you start sharing and then I'll take control later.
Well, Eleanor, because you did the original share, have you got it in your share options?
Yeah, well done.
Yeah, so it looks to me like for the participants who've had a bit of an issue, there's something that they can do at their end, and it's not something that I can do at mine necessarily. But hopefully what we're just doing will make a difference.
Okay, can you guys see the slides? I'm going to go to the place where...
We can see the slide now. It's on my screen now.
If someone can't see the slides, can you put it in the chat?
Yeah, can anyone see the slides? Can anyone not?
I can see them.
Okay, so you've got
control. Is having black screen anymore, so I think, yeah, it's all right now.
Luke, you've got control.
Yeah, I'm moving forward. Can you see me moving forward, Ella?
Yes, I can.
Are you seeing the slides? Yeah. I'll take it to. There was obviously a point about the question.
To see them, right? Okay, that's fine.
Thank you, everyone. Sorry about the technical issues there.
No worries.
I was just introducing the. I was just moving on to the qualitative stage of our analysis, and I am now seeing something of a lag. I don't know. I know you recommended at the beginning that if people are reducing their data sharing because if anyone's got their webcam, it looks like everyone's doing all of the things that help.
Yeah, so maybe try shutting down your microphone, mute your microphone and your camera, but I don't think any other cameras are on.
I'll take my camera off, but you don't need to see my camera.
I can see the voice tags slide.
Yeah, that's right. So I'll take it back to here. This seems like okay, right. I'm going to persist and presume that people have the option. I'll remind everyone that this is being recorded, so you'll see all the interruptions, but you'll at least be able to see the slides as well. So yes, moving on to this question of what types were used by particular groups. We had a whole range of references in each of the categories that people were using. So we needed to find a way to talk about these in a kind of more summative way. We grouped the individual tokens according to these themes, and you can see that some of these lend themselves quite nicely to the idea of personhood and complexity. So on the screen now, hopefully what you'll see are just some examples of the different tokens that we used in relation to voices. So descriptions of persons, whether they were a guy or a lady or groups of people, whether they had names. Some of them were described in more kind of functional ways as a kind of bully, for example. And then these social relationships as well. So all of this kind of thing indicated to us that there was a degree of personhood, a degree of social relationships as well. Other examples were less so. There was an important thing about pronouns here in that there was a tendency, obviously, when you're referring to another party to kind of use the third person. But we've also seen an example that Eleanor gave of the voice here assuming the point of view of the voice. So using the first person saying, I'm going to do this, etc., etc. And also the second person indicating that they could actually directly address the voice. So referring to the voice as you, for example. Just moving on, I mean, there's a whole range of kind of non-human or human-related types of manifestations, so supernatural objects and animals demonstrated here, which again go beyond and around the idea of personhood. And then you get these more kind of abstracted experiences, kind of detached images or sounds, which may or may not be attributed to a person. So I think that I'll try and move things along, given that we've had that disruption, but just to give a demonstration of the different kinds of descriptions that people are using here, and they get quite abstracted as well. So the key point that we observed was that looking at the range of these different types across the groups was that more of the complex participants were using names and describing voices in terms of social relationship terms. So as a relative or as a voice that has some kind of social relationship with another voice. And again, using that first and second person pronoun report, so demonstrating that they could take on the point of view of the voice or directly address it. Now, the second and third of our linguistic kind of components were collocates. So it's worth just briefly describing our approach to collocation. So these are kind of collated by lemma and filtered by part of speech, because we were specifically looking for adjective collocates and verb collocates. So based on a kind of pilot test of looking at the kind of precision and recall of where the collocates were occurring that were in specific reference to the voice, we established a kind of 3 token span. For adjective collocates, this was before and after the node, so words appearing before the reference to the voice and words appearing after it, relating to the description of the voice. And for verb collocates, just following the syntax, it tended to be the words that came after it that described what the voice was doing. So we set this collocational span of 3 tokens to the right for verb collocates. And since the description of complexity was about a variety, a whole range, demonstrating a range of qualities, we didn't want to apply any association measures that would exclude any of the content. So rather than using something that might indicate strength or exclusivity, like an MI score or a Z score, we basically included all of any collocates, and then our lists were ranked by kind of frequency. So we could tell which ones were coming up more often, but also we weren't ruling any out. With the adjective collocates, we went through a similar process as with the references to voices. So we had these groups of terms that, again, gave us an indication of person-like qualities, whether they were feminine or whether they had a sexual identity, whether they were old, whether they were American. And lots of descriptions of the kind of demeanor or attitude or emotion that these voices conveyed. So again, a whole range of being confident or mischievous or angry or annoyed. I think that there were potentially the more complex ideas, and thinking about that description of complexity in terms of intentional states were coming through when voices were described as having some kind of ideology or belief, and in terms of their capacity to do things. So that level of agency indicated in their ability, if you like. And then just to show some of the other categories here, references to whether it was coming through clearly, whether the voices were loud or low, and other descriptions like that. They were obviously also asked about the kind of frequency and duration of these voices as well. So for our purposes, complex participants spoke about their voices and also having this range of qualities that you could perceive to be sort of contrasting. So both good and bad experiences, nasty and nice experiences as well. So that complexity of being more than any one thing. In the minimal participants, a voice might typically bring one kind of experience, and then that would be essentially the extent of that interaction. And I'm going along with that, the use of the word different to suggest that any one voice was different in different contexts, so demonstrating a range of qualities once again. And just very quickly to talk about the verb collocates. So this being primarily a kind of auditory experience, we had lots of different descriptions of communication and sounds, what the voices were saying. They were criticizing or questioning or arguing or screaming. Thinking again about those intentional states and the point of view of the voice, if you like, showing more kind of perceptual or cognitive processes, movements and actions. And then again, references to where were their comings and goings, and how often they might appear. So the key things that we found with verb collocates was that in complex cases, or in cases coded as complex, there was a more indication of the capacity for dialogue, that the participants could interact with the voice, that it wasn't just a kind of one unidirectional communication. More of the voices in the complex cases were described as having some kind of intention or want, and the capacity to have an effect on the voice hearer. So we identified two particular types, make and stop, which demonstrated quite a clear distinction in that minimal cases had the capacity to make, for example, a racket, but in complex cases, they might make the participant feel a particular way. They had the capacity to influence what the voice hearer was feeling. And similarly with stop, we found that in the more complex cases, how the participants went about their lives was influenced by their interactions with their voices, stopping me from going out and seeing my friends, for example. So that I think the key contribution of that stage of our process to our overall evaluation of complexity was to get a sense of the trends that we might attribute to complex cases or minimal cases respectively. And that was in addition to having established that at a frequency level, there were these key distinctions. So while we have just a bit of time left, I think, Eleanor, you're happy to talk about the next stage, where we're looking at this degrees of complexity.
Yes, I am. I'm just going to take over the slide. I'm conscious from the chat that not everybody can see the slides from outside the university, so I will just summarize briefly, and then we've only got a few more slides, then we can have discussion and clarify things further. But I'll describe as much as I can what's on the slides. It's relatively straightforward. So what we've shown so far, we have 40 interviews. Somebody's asking why 40 interviews. That's what the colleagues at Durham collected. It's quite a lot of interviews for this kind of study. They were very lengthy interviews. As we said at the beginning, we have more than 200,000 words, which is a lot for this kind of corpus. And basically what Luke has shown is that we took the coding, the binary coding for minimal and complex personification that our Durham colleagues did, and treated the two sets of interviews coded minimal and complex as two corpora. We had 4 linguistic aspects that we took into account: length, how the voice was referred to, adjective collocates and verb collocates, showed that there are indeed, according to these linguistic aspects, statistically significant differences between the two groups, and then went further into looking at what kinds of other differences there are between minimal and complex subcorpora in terms of how the voices are described, referred to, what kinds of adjective collocates they have, so what kind of qualities they are attributed, and what kind of verb collocates they have, so what kinds of things they can do. But because we had figures associated with each interviewee according to the 4 linguistic aspects, we could also produce rank-ordered lists of all 40 interviewees for each of the linguistic aspects. And those of you who can see the slides now should be able to see the rank order lists for all the participants according to each of the 4 aspects. For those of you who can't see the slides, we have 4 columns. Each corresponds to one of our 4 linguistic phenomena, and the participants are ranked in terms of how they are positioned on that rank-ordered list. And what you would be able to see is that the complex participants, which are grayed out, have a gray background, tend to cluster at the top. The minimal interviewees tend to cluster at the bottom, but we've got overlap between the two groups in the middle. So first of all, what we're seeing is a way of turning a binary distinction into a matter of degree, which is a contribution, given that, as I said, even our psychology colleagues who implemented the binary coding would not claim that this is really an either-or distinction, even though there is something to be gained from treating it as either-or for some purposes. Secondly, this is a kind of visual representation of the finding that the linguistic analysis indeed broadly confirms the validity of the binary coding, but it also, this matter of degree approach also enables us to do other things. For example, we were able to identify people who tended to be at the top in all groups. So Leah, for example, one of the complex interviewees, has the highest average in terms of her rank list position of everybody else. So arguably, she's a really good example, or the best example of the top of the complexity scale. Conversely, Brad tends to come at the bottom. On average, he's got the lowest average rank list score. And so he's a good example of a minimal personification case. And then we have people who are in the middle, and here we're going to concentrate on Carl, who's the highest minimal case, and Violet, who's the lowest complex case. Now, by doing this, first of all, we are providing people who are interested in doing case studies, qualitative case studies, we're providing them with a principled way of picking people for case studies. And this is really important when there's a conflict in some fields between kind of quantitative approaches with statistical significance tests and qualitative approaches to individual case studies. And one of the accusations or criticisms that are made sometimes of the qualitative studies is, oh, but you just picked people who confirmed your points. Here we have principled ways of identifying 4 participants. But then you can also then look at what does the most prototypical complex case look like, what does the most prototypical minimal case look like, and what do the people look like in the middle. So very briefly, for each of these 4 people, you could do the kind of thing that Luke has done. In other words, look at what kinds of descriptions of the voices they have, what kind of adjective collocates they have, verb collocates they have. Here I'm just giving you very briefly some exemplary quotes. So you can see, using this approach, contrasting, for example, Leah, who's the top most complex person, Brad, who's the most minimal. You can have quotes that show this distinction. And the difference between the top and the bottom of the scale is very clear cut. So with Leah, you have, she says at one point, and then I was down the quayside and I was thinking, I'm going to have to sleep on this bench tonight. And I got rattled for it. The voice is rattled for it. No, this is the voice speaking. No, you're not sleeping here. Move, get up and walk, get up and move now. And they moved us, that's me, moved us off the quayside and told us that somebody had been raped there, and they got us moved off there, just told us to move towards X station. So here the voices are represented in direct speech, and they're getting Leah to do something. They're modifying her behavior. Brad, at the minimal end, says things like, it could be angry or it could be a disappointed voice, stuff like that, right? So note that even at the most minimal end, the voices are still person-like, but they have more minimal, more generic characteristics. They're not full-blown characters, like in the case of Leah. In the middle, however, and here we've got Violet, who's complex, but at the least the least complex of the complex cases, and Carl the opposite. There are similarities. You can see that in the middle, you really have a nuance in terms of difference. But it's still possible to see from the quotes why Violet was coded as complex. She talks about the voices having different kinds of modes of speaking. They can shout, they can talk like we do, they can whisper, but also the voices have intentional states, sometimes to do with the person, with Violet herself. So she talks about a whole incident when she disagreed with what the voices were telling her. And she says it was quite upsetting, it was really upsetting because I didn't want to be the person that Michael, who's one of the voices, wanted us to be. Carl, we've already seen, talks about his main voices just like an angry old cold, but he also attributes to the voices some internal states, except that he says they know him, they have knowledge of him, because he's aware that actually they come from him. So he says, because it's me, because he's aware that the voices are actually a part of him, they know what to say, you know, to annoy me. So they still do things to him, but he has a kind of explanation for why they do that. And indeed, this idea of continuity in experience of voice hearing is something that we have shown in a different study that has been published in Cognitive Neuropsychiatry, where we're actually looking at continuity, not just inside this group that we've talked to you about, but also when we put this group together with a group of spiritualists, interviews with spiritualists, people who hear voices but are not interacting with mental health services at all. So to conclude, to summarize, what we've shown you is that we've taken these two sets of interviews coded differently. We've indicated with reference to 4 different linguistic phenomena that the categorization, the binary categorization, can be supported. We have also identified additional quantitative and qualitative differences in the ways in which the two groups of people use language for their voices. There's a summary there. Luke has already talked about that. But we have also found a way to talk about degrees of complexity of personhood rather than just a binary distinction. And amongst other things, this enables us to select specific individuals as prototypical for particular positions on those scales, and also potentially for qualitative case studies. And sorry for the technical problems, there can always be some, but thank you very much. That's the end of our presentation.
We apologize for the tech issues, everyone. First thing we experience something like this, and thank you for bearing with us. Let's hope that the recording will be fine. All right, so we have time for question and session. Someone has already raised hand. Let me check. Okay, Elvis, yourself.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Yes. Hi, Elena. Hi, Luke. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for this very, very interesting presentation. So, like, your results really remind me of the study that I recently published about intrusive thoughts in OCD, and where I looked at specifically at how adjectives qualified the thoughts, so like the term thought. And so like, yeah, so like I also found, like, you know, the thoughts as, well, mostly the thoughts as dangerous, like affecting negatively the self, and they can change, they can talk, and so forth. And I was wondering, like, so in my paper, I had, because I published it in a psychology journal, they asked me, okay, but how do you conceptualize your findings in relation to the relationship between thoughts, like cognition and language? So I was wondering whether that is actually something essential for your study. And if so, how did you go around this question?
Luke,
Go ahead, Luke or Elena. Luke, you're still muted. Luke?
Hello, yes, I'm happy to respond. Yeah, thanks, Elvis. Yeah, no, it's a really important question, and I think, yeah, if you're publishing in psychology journals and things like that, I think that's something that would definitely demand acknowledgement and discussion in your paper. Yes. So when we've tried to write up this type of work, we have to either establish that we're not saying that what people say is an equivalence to what they're experiencing, that our focus is on the kind of narrative construction of that. So, you know, as linguists, we very typically talk about what we're focusing on is the expression of an experience. We can't really make too many claims about the reality of the experience itself. With the colleagues that we're working with, we're finding that the kind of precedents for linguistic inquiries into psychosis are more towards that kind of diagnostic end anyway. You know, there's this investigation of language deficit being some kind of reflection of mental states, for example. But we've tried to position ourselves in contributing more to the descriptions of lived experience, you know, trying to use these narratives that we have, saying, you know, this person is telling this story, they would tell it a million different ways, but in this context, this is what they chose to say about what they chose to represent their experience. So I think we very much have to explicitly position ourselves at that end first and foremost. And yeah, certainly try and avoid making any claims to any kind of phenomenological reality of what psychosis is. Yeah, we have to sort of establish we're talking about the telling of the experience rather than the experience itself. Just while we have, I've just noticed some questions in the chat. Related to that, someone's asked about how we identified the voice hearers. So the participants that we've spoken about in this study, the 40 participants, are all enrolled in clinical services for support for their voice hearing. So they were recruited by the team at Durham through the support services that are provided in that area of England. Hopefully that answers your questions. And I don't know if Eleanor has anything to add to Elvis's point.
No, let's see if anybody else has any other questions.
Yes, do we have any other question? If not, maybe you can elaborate more about that, Elena. Oh, there is one question in the chat box, actually, if you can see it.
And also,
so there's one in the chat, and I can see Syra, yeah, has got her hand up. So I'll start with the chat, if that's okay. So, well, Rafis asked, did you carry out the same analysis with voice hearers that do not access mental health services? Did you find a similar categorization applicable there? Yeah, so just at the end of the talk, Eleanor referenced another piece of work that we did, continuing this idea of degrees of experience. So that was with an additional cohort of self-identified spiritualists. So this is a group of people who are not seeking any services to help with their experiences. They probably wouldn't describe themselves as needing any kind of additional support in that way. And their experiences are, yeah, there's a lot to say about the kind of more kind of positive identifying aspects of those experiences. But we haven't then done the same depth of analysis that we've described here with that cohort yet. We did some preliminary work looking at a kind of scale of experience there. And then there's also a question here, is this study has also to do with vlogs? So, I mean, all of these interviews were conducted person to person by the interviewers who we're working with. I'm not aware of any associated work that has looked at those kinds of narratives that are kept in my kind of digital domains. But that's, as with most kinds of avenues of life, I'm sure there are groups online who will meet in that way, particularly given the current situation. Yeah, there's definitely groups who I'm sure would be recording their experiences in those digital spaces as well. Pri, I'm going to defer to you for sharing. I know that Sarah's had her hand up, but we are getting more questions.
Sarah has.
Sarah, and then with,
yeah, so Sarah, should we come to you?
You can unmute yourself, Sarah.
Hi there. Thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. Go ahead with your question.
Thanks so much. Fantastic presentation and really fascinating. I'm just wondering, you may have already answered this in different ways, but I'm just wondering, this is such an unlikely marriage. I find it unbelievable that some sort of voice hearing psychology type domain would think of approaching CAS or vice versa. How did this even begin? Maybe it's too broad for the time we have, but just curious. Thank you.
I can tell you. So some of it, there's always a little bit of serendipity. But anyway, I started being interested in doing linguistic analysis of voice hearing via a chance conversation with Sophia Demian, who used to be my student and worked with on a previous research project, just because she'd read an interesting autobiography. So we did a study, Sophia and I, of a first-person account, a kind of an autobiography of schizophrenia, and published it in Medical Humanities. And it was more of a sort of stylistically narratological take on autobiography. And that attracted a bit of attention, and we presented at various conferences. And then we were invited to speak at the University of Durham, where they already had a multi-million-pound project on voice hearing that was interdisciplinary, but didn't have any linguists at the time. And then even when it acquired a linguist, that person is neither a discourse analyst nor a corpus linguist. And so we went to speak there. And we all realized that we had interests in common, and in particular, they thought that our analysis could add something to what they were doing. So when we then, a couple of years later, applied for funding to extend CAS for another 5 years, one of the strands of work that we said we would do was this, and particularly collaborate with the people at Durham. So there was a bit of a chance at the beginning, but then it was a case of once we started talking, they who work already in a very interdisciplinary manner, they saw the potential of the collaboration, and we were very happy to collaborate. I should also say, connecting to what Elvis was saying before, we've said, Luke and I have said this many times, but the paper that has now been published in Cognitive Neuropsychiatry on the psychosis continuum, this study we just presented is not published yet. We haven't submitted it anywhere yet. That paper was desk rejected twice by 2 psychology journals because it just didn't fit. So it's not all smooth sailing when you do this kind of thing, but if you persist a little bit, you get there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Saida. Luke and Elena, it's already almost 4 o'clock, 1 minute to 3. But given that we had some tech issues, maybe you can take one more question. I think there's one question in
the chat. Maybe I'll start, Luke, and you can add. So basically, there are, in the distinction between minimal and complex, voices or noises associated with non-human entities, particularly objects, so there's banging and cars and all sorts of things, would count as minimal. I can't remember precisely what the situation is with animals, and maybe Luke can talk about that, but there are other typologies. There's, for example, a 4-way typology that is a little bit more like a scale that has this kind of non-human sounds, and then it moves all the way up to sounds from human-like entities and then very individualized entities. So that is partly taken into account to some extent. But Luke, do you remember any references to animals specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for the question, Gloriana. So this is the kind of thing that we were looking for in order to map out, again, the different ways in which you would get personhood, personification. So yeah, there were certainly instances where the voice would be described as something like a raccoon, but if that raccoon can talk to you, you know, that's not the same as a kind of conventional raccoon who doesn't have that capacity to talk. So, and there were lots of kind of supernatural type beings, so sort of angels and demons are very common. So the degree to which they were then also described as, you know, having thoughts and feelings and intentions, certainly placed them more within that kind of person-like domain. So we wanted to capture all of those, yeah. So any reference that was to a voice would tell you one thing, you know, it's described as a banging or as a raccoon or as a person. But that's why we went wanting to include those descriptions where other sort of person-like elements could come in. So even in the instance of banging, if that might have been described as, you know, someone trying to communicate through a banging. So we took that kind of inclusive, broad approach to include what might look like a sort of non-person referent to see if they also had those person-like qualities. Yeah. I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment. Given, as Pri said, that we had a little bit of disruption. I know we schedule these things obviously for reasons, but I'm happy just to hang around a little bit longer if anyone has any other further questions. Pri, I can see that you are sharing our UCREL information. I don't know if you are trying to speak as well.
Yeah, Pri, do go ahead, because it looks like we've answered all the questions that there were.
I'm not sure if we've lost Pri, but I think he's offering here. Okay, this is a reflection, obviously, the end of the term,
Hello?
the end of this term. There he is. Yes.
Okay. Can you hear me? Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Luke and Elena, for giving the talk. So I believe that there might be questions, but yeah, I think Luke and Elena are happy to take questions via email. And for your information, I have also informed via UCREL mailing list that this is the last UCREL CRS this term. On behalf of all UCREL team, I thank all the UCREL CRS presenters this term who come across the continents on the globe. Peter Crosswhite from the University of Queensland, Maria Victoria Pardo from Universidad del Norte, Colombia, Rafaela Bottini from CAS, Lancaster, UK, Carlina Denistia from University of Tübingen, Germany, Gede Primahadi from Universitas Udayana, Indonesia, and of course, Luke and Elena from CAS Lancaster University, UK. Thank you also for your active engagement, all UCREL audience from all over the world, and apologies for any inconveniences. And before this session officially ends, let me hand over to another UCREL organizer, Gloriana, who got a bit of announcement. Gloriana, go ahead.
Yeah, hi from my side. You haven't seen much of me during this term because we've had so many speakers from linguistics, and Pri did a really fantastic job of organizing and hosting all of those sessions. And this today was also the final session that Pri was hosting a UCREL seminar as a co-organizer, because he's now nearly done with his PhD. So on behalf of UCREL and also of Paul Rayson, who unfortunately can't join today because of diary clashes, I would like to offer a really very big heartfelt thank to Pri for co-organizing UCREL seminars in the last 1.5 years. Yeah, and we wish you all the best for wrapping up your PhD, and still hope to see you as attendant in UCREL talks in the future. And with Pri stepping down, we've now got a new co-organizer from linguistics in our team, which is Chloe, who you can also see on the slide. And Chloe said she's very happy to be approached for interests, people interested in UCREL CRS via her email address, which you can find on the slide, and also her Twitter account. And yeah, we will be back in the spring term, still continuing online. And we've still got spots for the spring term. So if you would like to present, then please get in touch with me or Chloe or also Isra. Yeah, thank you very much.
Everyone. So we hope to see you in the next UCREL terms. Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luke and Elena.
Bye. Bye.
Sorry for the inconveniences.
No problem. No problem.
No problem.
Bye.
Bye.